Good morning, or afternoon, whenever this video goes up. Today's coffee mug is a ceramic tumbler with a silicone travel lid on it. It's got lipstick on it. It doesn't come with lipstick. You have to put your own lipstick on it. And the insulating sleeve, I made this. I took one of those corrugated cardboard sleeves from a coffee shop or wherever and opened it up and traced it out because, you know, most of your Go cups are about this size / shape, and laid it out on the fabric and traced it out and sewed it up and put Velcro on it so it's a little bit adjustable, and that way I can put hot coffee in this ceramic mug and still be able to carry it around with me. I don't think I put any lining in this, but that's an idea. That's something that you can do, and if you're not handy with the needle and thread, then I'll post a link to a lady that I know that makes these and sells them. I found her after I made this one. I believe she has an Etsy page. I'll put a link in the description about that. Now, this is an interesting day. When I was doing the research for this day, October 4th, which, by the way, is 10/4, so you know it's going to be okay, 10/4. 10/4, October 4th, is the birthday of what was to me a surprising number of authors and other creatives throughout history. Pretty interesting research. So if your birthday is today, you share a birthday with some interesting and impressive creatives throughout history. We'll talk about some of them in the next few minutes. Alrighty, so let's get started and we'll find out all about it, starting all the way back on this day in the year 1582, which is considered the last day of the Julian calendar. The next day, the Gregorian calendar took effect by order of Pope Gregory the 13th. He wanted to realign events like the equinoxes and solstices with the calendar and ensure that Easter is always celebrated around the Northern Hemisphere's spring equinox. With the introduction of the new calendar, several days were skipped, and October the 4th was followed by October the 15th. Today, the Gregorian calendar is the most used calendar around the world. So, if the Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian calendar, what was the Julian calendar? I'm so glad you asked. The earlier Julian calendar was in use from 45 BC until 1582, and both are actually Christian calendars, but there are differences. What we call the Julian calendar was introduced to the world by Julius Caesar in 46 BC to replace the yet older Roman calendar, which Julius felt needed some reforming. The calendar he introduced divided the year into 12 months and contained 365 days with an extra day every fourth year to take into account the actual length of the 365.25 days for a solar year. That sounds just about exactly like what we have right now, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. But after a period of time, it was found that the Julian calendar left over close to a day in a period of 128 years, so that by 1582, the Julian calendar had actually drifted 10 full days from the actual date. The difference behind all that is really only a matter of minutes every year, but those minutes add up. So anyway, to reform the calendar, Pope Gregory the 13th introduced what we call the Gregorian calendar in 1582, which we still follow today. On this day in 1669, the Dutch painter Rembrandt died. On this day in 1822, Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, was born in Delaware, Ohio. On this day in 1861, President Lincoln watched a balloon ascend, like a hot air balloon. He observed this balloon demonstration near Washington, D.C. Both Confederate and Union armies experimented with using balloons to gather military intelligence in the early stages of the Civil War. But balloons proved to be dangerous and impractical for most situations. October 4th, 1861 is the birthday of Western painter and sculptor Frederick Remington. He was born in Canton, New York. Also on this day in 1862 is the birthday of Edward L. Stratemeyer, born in Elizabeth, New Jersey. He created the Hardy Boys, the Bobbsey Twins, the Rover Boys, and Nancy Drew. After writing about 150 books of his own, he created a company called the Stratemeyer Syndicate with a team of ghostwriters to write books based on his outlines. He swore everyone to secrecy and even invented fictional biographies for the imaginary authors. The Stratemeyer Syndicate went on to publish about 700 titles under more than 65 pseudonyms. It still sells about 6 million books each year. And I can tell you that when I was in grade school and junior high school, I read me a passel of Bobbsey Twins and Nancy Drew and even a little bit of Hardy Boys. And so if there are any children in your life who are avid readers, I recommend these books. In 1895 on this day, a fellow named Joseph Frank Keaton was born, better known to us as Buster Keaton. He was a star of silent film comedies. His parents were vaudevillians, and according to Keaton, he earned his nickname when, as a toddler, he fell down a staircase. Harry Houdini picked him up and dusted him off and said, "That was a real Buster your kid took." His parents added him to the act when he was 3 years old, and he quickly learned that the more serious he looked, the harder the audience laughed. Keaton became a solo act in the 1920s and made silent comedy classics such as The Navigator, The General, and The Cameraman. He was born in Piqua, Kansas on this day in 1895 and died in 1966 at the age of 70. On this day in 1914, the first German Zeppelin raided London. On this day in 1918, Germany telegraphed President Wilson to ask for an armistice. On this day in 1923, John Charles Carter was born. He's better known to us as the American film actor Charlton Heston. He was born in Wilmette, Illinois on this day in 1923 and died in 2008 at the age of 84. On this day in 1927, work began on Mount Rushmore. Gutzon Borglum began sculpting the heads of 4 U.S. presidents on Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills National Forest of South Dakota. It took about 12 years for the impressive granite images of 4 of America's most revered and beloved presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt, to be completed. In 1937, legendary blues singer Bessie Smith was buried near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on October 4th, 1937. Some 7,000 mourners attended her funeral. Smith had been killed a few days before when the old Packard she was driving hit a parked truck near Coahoma, Mississippi, between Clarksdale and Memphis. There's no record of Smith's exact birth date, but she was about 43 years old. This date in 1937 is the birthday of Jackie Collins, a novelist whose books have sold over 500 million copies. Her titles include Hollywood Wives and Drop Dead Beautiful. This day in 1941 is the birthday of Anne Rice, author of Gothic fiction, erotica, and Christian literature. Also known by her pen names Anne Rampling and A.N. Roquelaure, Anne Rice was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1970, she had a little daughter named Michelle who was diagnosed with leukemia and later died in 1972 at the age of 5. Rice fell into a deep depression and only got herself out of it by writing. She wrote constantly, and in 5 weeks she had finished her first novel. It was about a vampire who had become so lonely that he decided to turn a 5-year-old girl into a vampire to keep him company. He's horrified when he realizes she will never age and that she will remain a 5-year-old forever. That novel was Interview with the Vampire in 1974. It got mixed reviews and didn't sell very well, but it developed a cult following, and throughout the early 80s, it kept selling copies, slowly becoming one of the most popular vampire novels of all time. In 1944, General Eisenhower warned of the risk of shell shock. On October 4, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower distributed to his combat units a report by the U.S. Surgeon General that reveal the hazards of prolonged exposure to combat. The danger of being killed or maimed imposes a strain so great that it causes men to break down. And then he goes on to describe how they appear. And of course, nowadays we call that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and it can certainly result from the trauma of combat as well as traumatic situations other than combat. Anyway, on the basis of this evaluation as well as first-hand experience, American commanders judged that the average soldier could last about 200 days in combat before suffering serious psychiatric damage. British commanders used a rotation method, pulling soldiers out of combat about every 12 days for a 4-day rest period. This enabled British soldiers to put in 400 days of combat before being deleteriously affected. The Surgeon General's report went on to lament the fact that a wound or injury is regarded not as a misfortune but a blessing. The war was clearly taking a toll on more than just men's bodies. On this day in 1955, the Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series at last, beating the New York Yankees 2-0. They'd lost the championship 7 times already, and they'd lost 5 times just to the Yanks. But in 1955, thanks to 9 brilliant innings in the 7th game from 23-year-old lefty pitcher Johnny Podres, they finally managed to beat the Bombers for the first and last time. 1957, Sputnik. The Soviet Union inaugurated the space age with its launch of Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The spacecraft, named Sputnik after the Russian word for satellite, was launched at 10:29 p.m. Moscow time. Sputnik had a diameter of 22 inches and weighed 184 pounds and circled the Earth once every hour and 36 minutes. Traveling at 18,000 miles an hour, its elliptical orbit had an apogee, furthest point from Earth, of 584 miles and a perigee, nearest point, of 143 miles. Visible with binoculars before sunrise or after sunset, Sputnik transmitted radio signals back to Earth strong enough to be picked up by amateur radio operators. Those in the United States with access to such equipment tuned in and listened in awe as the beeping Soviet spacecraft passed over America several times a day. In January of 1958, Sputnik's orbit deteriorated as expected, and the spacecraft burned up in the atmosphere. The successful launch of Sputnik spurred the space race, a race between Cold War rivals USSR and US to gain supremacy in spaceflight. In 1965, on this day, Pope Paul VI arrived in New York, the first pope ever to visit the U.S. and Western Hemisphere. In 1966, Pope Paul VI addressed 150,000 people in St. Peter's Square in Rome and called for an end to the war in Vietnam through negotiations. Although the Pope's address had no impact on the Johnson administration and its policies in Southeast Asia, his comments were indicative of the mounting anti-war sentiment that was growing both at home and overseas. On this day in 1970, the amazing singer, songwriter, and sensitive creative Janis Joplin died of a heroin overdose at the tender age of 27. 1988, televangelist Jim Bakker was indicted on federal charges of mail and wire fraud and of conspiring to defraud the public. The precipitating event was probably that he'd had a brief affair with the former church secretary and then paid her over $350,000 to be quiet about it. But the arrangement became public, and then the scandal helped bring down the entire PTL ministry. Which reminds me of something a very wise man was given to say. If those people had been where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing, they wouldn't be in this mess right now. In 1990, the TV show Beverly Hills 90210 debuted. In 1992, shortly after takeoff, a cargo plane crashed into an apartment building near an airport in Amsterdam, Holland. 4 people aboard the plane and approximately 100 more in the apartment building lost their lives in the disaster. On this day in 2011, a man who had served 25 years for murder was exonerated by DNA evidence. Michael Morton, who spent 25 years in prison for his wife's murder, was released after DNA evidence implicated another man in the crime. Interestingly, the prosecutor in the case was later accused of withholding evidence that indicated Morton was innocent. On October 4th, 2011, Apple Incorporated announced the release of its much anticipated iPhone 4S. This iPhone was named 4S, where S stood for Siri, an iPhone 4S exclusive intelligent personal assistant that was later included in future generations of mobile Apple products. They announced 4S on October 4th, and then you could place your advance order October 7th, and then they were available in stores on October 14th. That's been an interesting innovation, a blessing and a curse, alternately and at the same time. And I guess that's going to wrap it up for us today on this day in history for October 4th, 10/4, okay? Thanks for watching. As always, links to my research are included in the show notes, along with a physical address if you'd like to send me a coffee mug. Give it a like if you enjoyed this video. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video if you found it interesting or informative. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. On October, okay, with the notifications. Oh, okay. Why do I always say it that way?